Well, today we're going to be focusing on God's promises and how that all kind of works, and how we, as God's people, engage in understanding His promises to us. And the lens of this whole thing is going to be the story of Hagar and Ishmael. We'll weave Abraham and Sarah into the midst of this. And in the midst of this, I'll have 5 truths that I want to share with you about God's promises. The interesting thing is where this whole thing starts is at the celebration, at the weaning of Isaac from Sarah. Now, we might think, well, that's kind of a weird thing to celebrate, but we don't really do that in our day and age. But back then, the infant mortality rate was of such that when a child would reach that point of being weaned from the mother, it was kind of a declaration that they're probably going to make it. They're probably going to be able to sustain themselves. And so here is this big celebration that Isaac has reached this age, probably age 2 or 3, somewhere in there. And it's all tainted. It all becomes bitter. It all kind of comes crashing down because of Sarah. And Sarah, it says, she sees Ishmael, and the word in the translation that we use today says he was making fun of Isaac. Now, you know this about me. I got to run down rabbit holes all the time because I go, okay, what was he actually? What's the Hebrew word there? What was actually going on? And you won't believe what I found out. Ready? Fasten your seatbelts. It is the exact same word that describes what Sarah did when she heard about the promise of giving birth to Isaac. She laughed. So Ishmael was either playing with or laughing with or maybe laughing at Isaac. Doesn't matter. Sarah interpreted it as Ishmael, who was probably about 16 at this time, as poking fun at her beloved Isaac, and then vis-a-vis to her and her pride. Says something about Sarah. Now, I want you to understand, as we look at all these individuals and we look at the promise of God, what we discover is none of these people are perfect. None of them deserve the promises that God gives them. So Ishmael had been born to Abraham through Hagar, right? And Sarah's maidservant. Do you know who came up with the idea that's how the promise should be fulfilled? Sarah. Yeah, we hear this in Genesis 16. We hear Sarah coming up with this plan, and this leads into the first point of the truths of God and His promises, is when we try to force God's hand or to fulfill God's plan on our own, things usually tend to get messed up. But even though they get messed up, we will not stop God's will from manifesting itself. Okay? So in chapter 16, this is what we hear. Now Sarai, Abram's wife, had borne him no children, but she had an Egyptian maidservant named Hagar. And so she said to Abram, "The Lord has kept me from having children. Go sleep with my maidservant. Perhaps," now listen to this, "perhaps I can build a family through her." Not God, but I, Sarah, I'm going to take control of this thing, and I'm going to make sure it happens. Forcing God's will, right? So by the time Isaac is 2 years old, got this whole weaning thing, right? Ishmael's about 16, and Sarah goes crazy. She can't stand looking at Ishmael. She can't stand looking at Hagar. As a matter of fact, she made the life for Hagar just intolerable, to the point that earlier, back in chapter 16, Hagar takes Ishmael and says, "We're out of here. I can't take this anymore." And when that happens, it's craziness ensues. Okay, Sarah, as this is going on, she goes to Abram. Right? Listen to this. She says to Abram, "You are responsible for the wrong I'm suffering." Whose idea was it? Sarah. But now suddenly it's Abram's fault. Well, come on, you should be laughing hysterically, right? Because that's what happens all the time in life, right? We come up with the idea, but then when it goes south, no, it's somebody else's fault. You're the one that's responsible. So she says, you are responsible for the wrong that I'm suffering, because I can't stand looking at Hagar anymore, right? I'm suffering. I put my servant in your arms, and now she knows that she's pregnant. She despises me. May the Lord judge between you and me. Abraham didn't want to send Hagar and Ishmael away. I mean, there's no culture that's kind of normal stuff that you do, right? There's no fatherhood that says that's what a normal father does, right? But God tells Abraham to do what Sarah wanted. I mean, was God afraid of Sarah too? No. God just knows he's God and she's Sarah, right? And so even though she is imposing something that is really bad, right? Really bad, God says, I'm still in control of this thing. God didn't say it was right to do what Sarah wanted, but God did promise to take care of Ishmael. So here's the second truth. God chooses who God chooses, right? God doesn't choose who I want God to choose, even though I would love to tell God who to choose and who to bless and who to give promises to. But God knows, and God decides, and sometimes to us, it looks crazy who God chooses. Back in chapter 16, Hagar experiences this promise. She's run away, right? She's taken Ishmael away, and the angel of the Lord comes to her. She's on her way to Egypt, and he comes to her. She's heading back home, and the angel says this to Hagar: go back to your mistress, go back to Sarah, and submit to her. And then the angel added, tell me if this sounds familiar, I will so increase your descendants that they will be too numerous to count. Sounds almost like the promise to Abraham. But God is very clear that the promise to Abraham is going to come through Isaac, but at the same time, there's almost the exact same blessing promise that is given to Ishmael and to Hagar. The angel of the Lord also said, you are with child, you'll have a son, and you will name him Ishmael, for the Lord has heard your misery. So just like Isaac means laughter, where God brought this promise to Sarah and she laughed at the craziness of the promise and then named the kid Laughter, here Hagar names Ishmael at the instruction of the angel. God has heard. God has heard. Third promise of truth. When God makes a promise, it will be completed as God intended, despite our best efforts to interfere. We'll try to get in the way, but we won't stop God's promise from becoming real. It's kind of like that passage in Isaiah that says, the word of the Lord will not return to the Lord void, but it will accomplish the very thing for which the Lord sent it to do. So where Abraham is living at this time is absolute desert. And so he follows the Lord's command to do what Sarah asked, and so he gives Hagar and Ishmael some food and some water and sends them out into the wilderness. Ishmael, remembers, about 16 at this point, and in the text that we read earlier, he ends up being cradled by his mother under a bush. I mean, imagine a 16-year-old reaching that point where she just can't take care of him anymore. And it says she's reached the point that she says, I have to leave him there. I have to go a long ways away. I have to go as far as I can shoot an arrow because I can't watch him die. And she sits there, counting down the moments where her son will no longer be alive. And in the midst of that horrendous story, we're told that God heard the boy crying, and the angel of God called to Hagar from heaven, and he said to her, what's the matter, Hagar? What's going on? Don't be afraid. God has heard the boy crying while he lies there. Lift up the boy, take him by the hand, for I will make him into a great nation. Even though it looks like everything is horrible right now, I'm going to fulfill my promise. And then God opened their eyes, and they saw a well of water, and she went, she filled the wineskin, gave the boy a drink, and the boy grew up, and it said God was with him. God was with him. So God responded to Ishmael's cry by sending this angel to speak to Hagar in his weakened estate, and God opened her eyes, and she saw how the promise could be fulfilled. So God was taking care of them, providing what they needed, but they really couldn't see it until they reached a point where they acknowledged their need for God. Here's the fourth truth. Our standard of fair and unfair may or may not match God's standard. I mean, this is a horrendous story, right? I mean, this is an awful story. It's like, I don't even want this story to be in the Bible, but it's there. And yet in the midst of that, God's promise still comes forth. Laughter at the promise, Isaac, and seeing God in the promise, Ishmael, they live apart, and yet they also are near each other. The reason we know this is much later in Genesis, the 25th chapter, we hear of the death of Abraham. And it's described this way. Although Abraham lived 175 years, it's a good old age, right? 175 years. Abraham breathed his last, died at a good old age, the Bible says, an old man full of years, and he was gathered to his people. In other words, he was buried in the midst of where those who had gone before him. And Sarah, by this time, has already died. So he's taken to where she's buried. And it says, verse 9, chapter 25, his sons, Isaac and Ishmael, bury him at the cave of Machpelah, near Mamre, in the field of Ephron, the son of Zoar the Hittite, the field Abraham had bought from the Hittites. There Abraham was buried beside his wife, Sarah. So there's interaction between Ishmael and his descendants and Isaac and his descendants, and it continues on even past that. In Genesis 27, it says Ishmael lived 137 years. He breathed his last, and he died, and he was gathered to his people. But we learn this about his people, his descendants. They live in hostility toward all their brothers. As a matter of fact, that same angel that said, Ishmael, name him, God has heard, he's going to be a wild donkey of a man, and he's going to cause all kinds of problems, right? And it carries on into his descendants. Genesis 28 talks about how the family still interacts. Esau, do you remember who Esau's father was? Isaac, right? Esau's father is Isaac. Chapter 28, verse 6, it says, Esau realized how displeasing the Canaanite women were to his father Isaac. So he goes to Ishmael and marries Mahalath, who is a sister of Nebaioth, who is a daughter of Ishmael. So he married like a second cousin or something like that, in addition to the wives he already had. Josephus, who's a Jewish historian outside of the biblical text in a work called the Antiquities, says this about Ishmael. The sons of Ishmael inhabited all the country from the Euphrates to the Red Sea. They called it Nabatean. They are an Arabian nation. They named their tribes from these sons, both because of their own virtue and because of the dignity of Abraham, their father. Now, some people think that Ishmael is the father of Muslims. But that is not necessarily technically correct, because not all Arabs are Muslims. There are also Arab Christians. The Quran is written in Arabic, but there are also Bibles written in Arabic. Islam, however, teaches that Muhammad was a descendant of Ishmael because he was an Arab. So here we have this just merging of the traditions of Islam and Judaism and Christianity, all just kind of weaving themselves together with Ishmael and Isaac and Abraham and all this stuff. Paul, I think, unties that knot and explains things from a spiritual way in a very powerful passage in Galatians chapter 4. He says that Hagar is the representation of slavery because she was a slave. and she is bound by the law. And Mount Sinai is in the Arabian Peninsula, so she becomes this symbol of the law. Sarah is seen as the free woman, and that the promise that God made is lived out in this freedom. And then in chapter 5, he goes on and says this, "Tell me, you who want to live under the law, do you know what the law actually says? The scriptures say that Abraham had 2 sons, one from his slave wife, one from his freeborn wife. The son of the slave wife was born in a human attempt to bring about the fulfillment of God's promise, but the son of freedom was born as God's own fulfillment of his promise." These 2 women serve as an illustration of God's 2 covenants, the old and the new. Chapter 5, he says, "So Christ has truly set us free." This is where the knot is untied. "Now make sure that you stay free. Don't get tied up again in slavery to the law." So here's the 5th promise, the truth of promises. God's greatest blessing is beyond genealogy. I mean, it doesn't matter what line you want to trace yourself back to Abraham. It doesn't matter. And it's not about land. It's not a particular identification of land, nor is it in keeping the law, the way you carry out your religiosity. It has everything to do with Christ. He goes on. He says, "Listen, I, Paul, tell you this. If you're counting on circumcision to make yourself right with God, then Christ will be of no benefit to you. The Jews circumcise as a part of the covenant when the child is an infant, and Muslims do it when they're in middle school age, because that's when Ishmael was circumcised." He says, "I'll say it again. If you're trying to find favor with God by being circumcised, by keeping the law, you must obey every single regulation in the entire law of Moses. For if you're trying to make yourself right with God by keeping the law, you've cut yourself off from Christ. You've fallen away from God's grace. But we who live by the Spirit eagerly wait to receive faith, the righteousness that God has promised to us. For when we place our faith in Jesus Christ, there's no benefit in being circumcised or not being circumcised. What is important," Paul says, "is faith expressing itself in love." Faith expressing itself in love. This becomes the Christian truth. This becomes our mark. It doesn't matter how we trace our lineage back to Abraham. It doesn't matter about land. It doesn't matter about any of that stuff, keeping the law. What matters is us keeping our eyes and our hearts upon Jesus Christ and believing that what he did on the cross has set us free from the power of law, from the power of sin, from the power of the evil one. God's promise to us is deep and rich and ties itself to that great historical movement of God in his salvation history. So Thanksgiving is this week, and I got a challenge for you. Take your insert and put it on your Thanksgiving table. And at some point in the meal, someone, the boldest person in your group, I guess, start asking some of these questions. I mean, imagine these becoming your questions around the Thanksgiving table. And I'm talking about the talk topics over here. Tell about the most desperate, heartfelt prayer you can remember praying. I mean, wouldn't that be fun to hear everybody's prayers? And how did God answer? And what did that make you think about God? What was your attitude about God in the way God answered that prayer? Why do you think God answers prayers differently? Look at how God answered the prayers for Hagar and Ishmael and Sarah, and it's all over the board, right? Explain how God can truly hear prayers when so many people are praying all at once. I mean, you got people from Penn State praying for them to win, and I mean, what does God do with that, right? I'm joking. And what personal evidence do you have that God always hears our prayers? To talk about your experience in your own prayer life. And for the next generation to hear you talking about that, I think is significant.